I'm Deborah Taylor Gonzalez Garcia, and I'm excited to share with you a bit about Greer Cemetery and the Friends of Greer Cemetery. Its story is one of a wider story that needs telling and action. Cemetery preservation isn't just about making the space look good, it's about our collective history. Remembrance of the Ones That No One Remembers by Sarah Lynn Carsey. Walter Carter, Eva Durr, James and Della Carrington, Cedar Sanford, Lewis Thorpe, and Robert Harrington. What happens to the dead when no one remembers? Do they shudder and shiver with no more to give, or dwindle and diminish like a fire's final ember? Do they joyfully journey to their next life to live, or join the broken band of blotted out members? In Durham, on the corner of Colonial and Camden, just inside of I-85, is a cemetery that has been marginalized just as the community it represents were pushed to the side. The people within Greer Cemetery were Durham citizens who built and shaped Durham. At one time, you could drive by and not know it existed. Most people in Durham still do not know it exists. Descendants couldn't find it. Greer Cemetery is not unique. We've seen the headlines from various places of rediscovered cemeteries, cemeteries that are built over, hidden from view, and forgotten. These cemeteries are not new, and African American communities have worked to keep these things from happening, some for a long time without any acknowledgement. These burial grounds hold our histories and genealogies that reflect our communities as they existed before. Why is this topic important? And better yet, why should it be important to you? How many of your community cemeteries reflect the African American experience? Where are the African American leaders, entrepreneurs, politicians, educators, bricklayers, domestics, and laborers of your community buried? How are their legacies reflected in your community's burial grounds? How many times has a cemetery provided you with a genealogical answer or lead? These burial grounds hold our histories and genealogies. They reflect our communities as they existed before us. This preservation is not a how-to manual for cemetery preservation. It's a call to action to save our histories. I'll tell the story of Greer Cemetery through the actions of the Friends of Greer Cemetery as we answer the call to why it's important. Today, no records can be found on the early history and care of Greer Cemetery. How and to whom burial spaces were sold and where people are buried, except those without markers, we don't know. We can only speculate that the cemetery was established out of a growing need of African Americans moving from the rural areas for the tobacco and later textile jobs. The earliest known deed was created in 1877 when land was sold by Frederick and Polly Greer to three men, John O'Daniel, Nelson Mitchell, and Willis Moore. These three men were young, in their 20s. They had been formerly enslaved. Two were carpenters, and all three were masons. That time, the open farmland was part of Orange County, with the core of the city of Durham about 5 miles south of the cemetery. Of the three, John O'Daniel is the most well known. Having been enslaved by the Carr family, he remained with them after emancipation, working for Julian Carr. Julian Carr was one of North Carolina's wealthiest individuals and philanthropists, even to the African American community, and yet at the same time a very white supremacist and KKK supporter. Interestingly, John O'Daniel was always referred to as his right-hand man. When John O'Daniel died, Julian Carr paid his respects as seen in the newspaper article. However, as shown in the article, his tribute is not about the life of John O'Daniel, but of the Carr family. In May 1917, Julian Carr named one of his hosiery mills after O'Daniel and only employed African Americans, a first that we think was throughout the country. This gave the African American community employment beyond medial jobs and boosted their income potential. It is rumored that John and Julian were half-brothers. Since the early 1900s, the cemetery began to see signs of wear. An 1897 Durham Sun newspaper article provided a physical description of the cemetery at that time. The reporters observed that there were several hundred graves close together and only 2 to 3 marble tombstones. Mostly wooden head and footboards were used. In the 1930s, the cemetery was closed due to being overcrowded. Oral history states that there are burials on top of each other. It wasn't by choice. By the early 1900s, the African American community were petitioning the city for another cemetery. There was room in Maplewood Cemetery, established in 1872. African Americans were denied burial in it, even though they were paying taxes to maintain Maplewood, and Greer Cemetery was not maintained by the city. It wasn't until 1927, when Beechwood Cemetery opened, that a public city-supported cemetery was available to African Americans. But burials continued where plots were already set aside, and at the same time, some people were moved from Greer Cemetery to Beechwood, such as John O'Daniel in 1936. The African American community asked to expand Greer Cemetery instead of opening another one, but the growing white neighborhood fought against it and won. Eventually, what was once open farmland without trees and home, reforestation began. Without intervention to control it, the cemetery was taken over and hidden. Vandals and others, both intentionally and unintentionally, have affected the cemetery grounds, from careless lack of respect or indifferent desire to encroach. Modern trash destruction have inflicted damage on the sacred grounds. As we begin to reclaim the cemetery, the physical environment begins to tell its story. Its beauty is formed by the memories of those whose remains it contains. The physical structures also tells us stories about the people and the community. Epitaphs provide stories of love, commitment, loss, and family. Connections are made to family members and more. Wealthy employers paying homage to longtime employees in the only way they knew, from their perspective. There are examples of Sears and Roebuck mail-order monuments from the early 1900s and concrete cast monuments used during the late 1800s. Symbols on monuments represent organizations that indicate the social life of the time, such as the Masons, King David, the Grand United Order of Oddfellows, the latter of which had 3 lodges in Durham. Bessie Wilson, Mamie Latta, and Minnie Lawson, Mary Hamilton, Samuel Hargrove, and Bertha Dawson. Now, who does this harm, you may care to wonder, this removal of memory, this deletion of thought? It hurts all of us, the older, the middle, the younger. Without a past to preserve, our present is naught. Trampling our history, what a terrible blunder. We destroy our future by discarding their past, by forgetting of stories and erasing the life, trampling the tenets their tombs trespassed. By dismissing their struggles, joys, and strife, we overlook the unnoticed and omit the outcast. Many of the surnames found in the cemetery are family names that still exist in Durham today. There are people in the cemetery who have a wider presence than Durham in our history. Some are connected to places in North Carolina, Winston-Salem, Warrenton, High Point, Bladen County, and others to other states. To tell the life stories and preserve the legacy of the people in Greer Cemetery has been an honor of the Friends of Greer Cemetery. I'm going to share a couple of these stories. However, they represent a small portion of the over 1,700 stories to discover and tell. On July the 27th, 1911, a group of parishioners from St. Joseph AME Church boarded a Seaboard airline train headed to Charlotte for a day of fellowship. I'm sure there was excitement in the air as they headed towards their destination. Older people talking, children excitedly anticipating a day of fun, swimming in the lake, anticipation of the food they would enjoy packed in their picnic baskets. As the train headed into Hamlet, right in front of the Hamlet Roadhouse at 10:40 a.m., their train collided head-on with another train. The impact greatly impacted the fourth and fifth cars, which were old and frail and crumbled like pasteboard. They were wooden cars and carried the passengers from St. Joseph AME Church. 7 people died from impact. The injured waited for hours to be transported to the closest African American hospital, which was in Charlotte. They arrived there about 7 p.m. Over the next few days, several others died, and several of those who died are buried in Greer Cemetery. This slide is dedicated to the children in Greer Cemetery. Childhood mortality rates were high in the early 1900s, late 1800s, especially for African Americans. Harris and Harvey Banks were born in Suffolk, Virginia, in January or February 1925. Their parents were George Banks and Lily Manley. By spring, they were living in Durham, North Carolina. And Harris died on June the 1st. On June the 1st, the same day as his son died, George Banks went about the task of burying his infant son Harris in Greer Cemetery. On June the 11th, the family experienced the tragedy of losing their other son Harvey. The next day, George Banks buried his son Harvey in Greer Cemetery. At this point, he had placed both his sons in the earth for eternity and entrusted their care to Greer Cemetery. There are many more stories like this one, along with those who died from the Spanish flu and other prevalent illnesses of that time, such as TB. There were several family groups who settled in Durham from the Stagville plantation, where at one time over 900 enslaved people lived. The Banks family is one of them. Sylvia Banks and several of her children and family members are buried in Greer Cemetery. Judy Banks, Sylvia's daughter, was matron of the train station, and based on newspaper articles, she was well known and referred to as Aunt Judy. She and her other siblings were landowners and well-known community members. P.W. Dawkins was born in 1862 in Newberry, South Carolina. He began teaching at the age of 22 in Georgia before receiving a mission to Hampton University. After his graduation in 1886, he taught at the High Point Normal School before moving to Durham, North Carolina, and teaching there for a few years. In 1901, Dawkins and his family left Durham to take a position at the Penn School in St. Helena Island, South Carolina. There, he was in charge of the industrial and agricultural departments. He then left the Penn School to work at the Kittrell College in Vance County as the president, and by 1909 he was principal of the West End Graded School in Durham. And there he stayed until his death. P.W. Dawkins represents the advancement and gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction, only to have it shattered by Jim Crow. There are so many more stories in Greer Cemetery to discover that deserve their place in the history books. You're probably wondering, how did the Friends of Greer Cemetery move from a silence to action? We organized. The Friends of Greer Cemetery formed in the early 2000s as a grassroots group, but we knew to make a lasting impact we had to formalize. In 2019, the group reorganized as a nonprofit organization under the North Carolina Statute 529. Our first focus was to bring awareness to the cemetery. We held events to educate the community about the cemetery. This in turn helped to bring in much needed funding. We set a membership fee of $5 to make it easy for anyone to belong. Having several universities with law schools in the area, we asked for assistance to move to a 501c3. And in 2020, with the assistance of the UNC Law School, Friends of Greer Cemetery now has a 501c3 nonprofit status. This gives us the ability to apply for grants and funding. We then took the time to develop a logo and a mission statement so that we could present ourselves as a professional organization to the community. We also took the time to educate ourselves and create a network of experts. For example, the state cemetery specialist in the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology has become a trusted source for information and support. Creating connections with city and county leaders has been invaluable. Our first major accomplishment was the commitment of the Durham City Services to provide a major cleanup and quarterly maintenance in Greer Cemetery. It was a major step towards making right the social injustice that was inflicted on the community members that Greer Cemetery contains. Partnerships with other like-minded groups provides all types of support. Keep Durham Beautiful organizes cleanup days and solicits volunteers. Preservation Durham has provided operations support and a meeting place. Stagville State Historic Site has helped us build the life stories from their records and artifacts of the emancipated people who moved to Durham from the site. And then area universities, such as Duke University, has provided funding, and through a service learning class, students perform cleanup in the cemetery and research. Some students have remained dedicated to Friends of Greer Cemetery. Several Boy Scouts have created their Eagle Scout Award by completing a project in the cemetery. Other school groups, such as Durham Technical Community College, has come and did cleanups. But one of the most important work that has begun is descendant outreach. We have found this to be one of our more difficult tasks. However, with the research and visibility and talking with area churches and funeral homes, progress is being made. Above all that we do, the desire to involve descendants is our driving force. Our philosophy is that the cemetery belongs to the descendants. Our approach is holistic. It's more than just making the cemetery look good. It's also about the people. We have held education sessions to train volunteers on how to do genealogical research. One of the ongoing efforts of our research team is the Day of Honor post. A story on the birthday of a person buried in Greer Cemetery is posted on our Facebook page, such as the one on Olivia Tilley, Will shown here. We wanted to honor them as living people and not a headstone. Unfortunately, there are too few that we know their birthday. When the pandemic put a stop to group events, we went online using Zoom and Facebook. We began to submit grants and have received 2. The output of one is currently in progress, in plain sight, which is an outdoor exhibit with 10 panels each with a specific focus, such as faith communities, cemetery history, education, and out of slavery. My favorite one is Seeds of a Movement, showing a small representation of other cemetery groups. As I stated at the beginning, this is a bigger movement. Several of us are working to expand our network to build a regional or national coalition. By sharing information, building a support structure, we can grow. Together, we can accomplish much more than alone. And we're always looking for new members to join us. For more information about the Friends of Greer Cemetery, you can contact us via email at friendsofgearcemetery@gmail.com. Also, visit our Facebook page. You can read some of those Day of Honor posts. We also have recordings of online events that we held that are available through our Facebook page. Drop us a post. If you're interested in the Cemetery Coalition group, you can send an email to aacemeteries.coalition@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. I'm going to leave you with another portion of the poem created by a student with her impressions of Greer Cemetery in its flight. Her reflections of what is Greer Cemetery. Sylvester Dollard, Kenneth Bishop, and Jettie Bell, Julia Finch, Janetta McAdams, and Daisy Blackwell. If you still haven't yet been persuaded, if community culture means little to you, who cares about graves dirty and degraded? Ask yourself this and please answer true. Do you want to become one of the fated? These harms after death are akin to a curse, ensuring inequality, turning memories into tatters, sowing sadness, and justice will follow the hearse. This place, people, and stories truly do matter, remembering our past, our wrongs to reverse. Thank you for joining me.